Well, Anne Lamott, how many folks here are familiar with Anne? Oh, yeah, okay. Well, if you know her writing, you know how beautifully she writes about spirituality. And she is much beloved, I think, because she is funny and just disarmingly honest about her life, all the ups and downs and the doubts and then the grace that sneaks in when we least expect it. And every so often, of course, she appears in churches and in bookstores in this area because she lives just up the road in Marin County. But one story she tells about her 7-year-old grandson who has a room located just down the hall from her own bedroom. Some days her grandson will say to her, "You know, Nana, this could be the best year ever." But then sometimes in the middle of the night, he calls out from his room and says, "Nana, will you ever get sick and die?" And Lamont says her grandson is really like almost all of us. We are a mixed bag of happy anticipation and absolute dread. And I admit that's true for me because life has a way of swinging between those two poles, the excitement of what might be and the quiet fear of what might go wrong. And the older we get, the more we can discover that a whole lot of our worry and stress in general has to do with our need for control. Fear and control appear to me to be two sides of the same coin, and one feeds the other, and I'm never sure which side of that coin is going to land face up. We want to know how things will turn out. We want to manage outcomes. We want to keep our future neatly contained. But the deeper truths of life, and maybe the most difficult, is that we can't control everything. And maybe paradoxically, to live fully and with freedom means letting go of some control. It means staying open to the unexpected. It means being willing to notice the things that challenge our assumptions or that upset the tidy and neat plans that we've made, and learn how to somehow be at peace anyway. I think that means learning to receive the peace that God offers, even in those moments when our discomfort and our discombobulation and our dread seem to be the loudest. And that brings me to the prophet Elijah. There are a whole lot of prophets in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's hard to keep them all straight. But generally speaking, prophets were people who were called to speak on God's behalf. And occasionally, if their words were not convincing enough, God would back up the prophets with some dramatic display of spiritual power. And that sounds impressive enough, but the truth is, no one in their right mind would ever want to be a prophet, would volunteer for that job, because prophets were almost always called to confront the people in power or to just challenge society itself, which made prophets rather unpopular. People thought they were crazy. Sometimes they were threatened. Often their very lives were in danger. But so being a prophet was a whole lot less like being a celebrity, even though everyone knew who you were. It was more like being a government whistleblower during the reign of a very popular dictator. So imagine this. Suppose I'm a prophet, and suppose I announced that God had declared it was a sin for you to root for your favorite sports team. Now, of course, if your favorite team is the Dallas Cowboys, that would indeed be a sin. But what if it meant no Giants games, no 49ers, no watching any of that on TV? Why? Because according to God, or at least what I claimed God was telling me, cheering for those teams was a form of idolatry, and unless you stopped, God would smite you. You would probably tell me to go jump in the bay, or words to that effect. You'd say, "Come on, you're being ridiculous. It's only sports." And if I kept that noise up, you would find another preacher pretty quickly. But what if the issue was a lot more serious? Suppose we lived in a place and in a time where a king and a queen ruled with an iron fist. The king now belonged to our culture and ostensibly at least shared our values and our ethics. But the queen, well, the queen was from somewhere else, and she practiced rituals that were devoted to another god, a god named Baal. And suppose those rituals included things like human sacrifice. And yet, oddly enough, the queen was glamorous, popular, powerful, a reality TV star who was hard not to watch for all the drama going on around her. And part of that drama was sacrificing a few folks now and then to appease Baal, who controlled the weather, among other things, and who doesn't appreciate nice weather. So most people shrugged and said, well, yeah, we know that our faith and our God doesn't approve of this kind of thing, but what's the problem with a little diversity of religious practice now and then? Sure, it may be human sacrifice, and that's an ugly business, but those victims were in prison anyway, right? So, what's the harm? I mentioned control earlier, and the truth is, most of those religions in the ancient world that practiced human sacrifice did that as a method of control. It was a political strategy. It wasn't so much a belief that you were pleasing a wrathful God as it was a way to employ terror to keep people in line. And that was the world Elijah lived in. Ethics, civics, norms of human decency and kindness and justice. Well, those things had eroded under the spell of this queen. And who was this wicked queen? Her name was Jezebel, which is such a great name for a villain. There's a reason we don't name our children Jezebel. It has certain connotations. I had a friend in college. He had a cat named Jezebel. Now, she was a lovely domestic short-hair cat, if you know anything about cats, and she would cozy up to you like she wanted to be friends. He'd pet her, but then when he least expected it, she'd scratch and bite. And then she'd sit back and stare at you, just to dare you, to see if you were stupid enough to try it again, to fall for her charms, which I was. That's Jezebel. And Elijah's unlucky calling, well, it was to stand up to Jezebel, to condemn her and the injustice and the brutality practiced by her religion, and to publicly demonstrate that her gods were powerless. It was really dangerous work, but Elijah did it. So in a dramatic showdown on Mount Carmel, a place where anyone for miles around could witness this spectacle, he humiliated Jezebel's priests, and he proved that the God of Israel was not just another local deity, but the God of the universe. The crowd cheered, but victory did not last long because, unsurprisingly, Jezebel was furious. So she controlled the army, and she ordered Elijah to be hunted down and killed. So Elijah ran for his life. And he ran far, deep into the wilderness, to another high place, Mount Horeb. And you might recognize it by another name, Mount Sinai, the very same mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments from God. And there at Mount Sinai, Elijah waited. So imagine this scene. A lonely man in a cave, cold desert nights, blazing hot days, and fear, real fear, almost overnight. He'd gone from being a hero to being a fugitive. The people he thought were going to support him, they had vaporized, they had vanished. The queen's soldiers were out looking for him. So Elijah felt completely alone. He tells God as much. I've been deserted. Only I'm left. And Jezebel's army is seeking my very life. This is the language of exhaustion and dread. And honestly, most of us know something about those feelings. We may not have an angry queen trying to kill us, but we know what it feels like when life corners us, when we're worried about the future, when anxiety keeps us awake at night, when we feel like we have run out of options and all we can do is hide out for a while and just try to catch our breath. So what do we do in those moments? Anne Lamott offers some wonderfully simple wisdom. First, she says we have to admit that life itself is just a paradox. Nothing we can do about it. Life is beautiful, and life can be impossibly hard. Joy and heartbreak live side by side, and we expect life to be tidy and predictable. We're going to be disappointed. Second, she says something that sounds almost like advice from an electrician or the guy at the computer store. Almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including yourself. In other words, sometimes the healthiest thing we can do is just simply pause, step away, let our minds breathe for a moment before we return to whatever it is we're facing. And then there's this insight. Peace of mind cannot be purchased and it cannot be engineered. It grows from the inside, from that quiet place where God already lives. Which means the peace we're searching for is not something we always have to find. It's something we only have to uncover. And Anne Lamott reminds us of something else. It's super important. It's easy to forget when we're afraid. Everyone is scared. Everyone is scared sometimes. The people who look confident, people who seem to have their lives all put together, but everyone carries worries and wounds that we cannot see. So, comparing our insides to other people's outsides does not help. It only makes us feel more alone, and that's not an accurate picture of how things are anyway. Finally, she says something that sounds almost like the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our time on earth is forgiveness school. Forgiveness school. We're here to learn how to forgive others, sure, but also how to forgive ourselves. Because holding on to guilt and resentment weighs us down. Grace, on the other hand, lifts us up. Grace is the discovery that we are loved, not because we have earned it, but because we simply exist. From the time we were small children, many of us, unfortunately, were taught that love is a commodity. We get affirmation as a reward, not as a gift. We win the prize of affection only when we've passed some kind of a test, not because kindness and attention are necessary for stable human development. Why do adults ever treat children like that and imprint them with these incorrect notions that can last a lifetime? Well, mostly because that's how they learned, those parents or others learned that that's the way things work. It's sort of like alcoholism. It can be a generational thing to pass along that kind of pain, usually without realizing you're even doing it. But grace, the unearned gift, the word or the gesture of acceptance and affection and affirmation that did not require that a test first be passed or a hoop first be jumped through, that's the kind of love that changes us. That's the kind of love that awakens peace, a real inner peace of mind and heart and soul. And often those deepest moments of peace come in ways we don't even expect. They arrive quietly, in a conversation, in a moment of stillness, in a breath of calm that interrupts our worry. And that brings us back to Elijah up in that mountain cave. If Elijah expected God to show up in the way God had, let's say, in Moses' time, well, Elijah was probably bracing himself for some kind of major spectacle. Thunder, lightning, fire from heaven. Sure enough, dramatic things did start to happen. A mighty wind tears through the mountains, an earthquake splits the rocks, a fire blazes. But then something really surprising happens. Or more accurately, it does not happen. Elijah realizes that God's presence and peace, it's not in the wind. God's not in that earthquake. God's not in that fire. Instead, after all that noise, there came the sound of sheer silence. And in that silence, Elijah senses the presence of God. Not overwhelming, not terrifying, just there. And then God speaks. What are you doing here, Elijah? That's not a scolding question. It's more like a gentle nudge, a reminder that Elijah's life is a lot bigger than his fear, and that his story is absolutely not over, and that running away from trouble doesn't solve the real problem, the trouble that's following you, that hiding in a cave is not the final chapter. God reminds him there's still work to do, still hope to carry forward. And then God reveals something Elijah didn't even realize, that he's not alone anyway. There are 7,000 people in Israel, God says, who have not bowed to Baal, who've not prostrated themselves before that evil queen. 7,000? And all this time Elijah believed he was the only one left. But he wasn't, and he never had been. His fear had narrowed his vision. God opened it up again. And I suspect that happens to us a lot more often than we realize. Fear has a way of shrinking our world. It convinces us that a problem is bigger than it is, that we're more isolated than we really are, that the future is darker than it must be. But when we pause long enough to listen, I mean really listen, we sometimes discover something else, that we're not alone, that there's help that we couldn't see before, that grace has already been moving through our lives, coursing quietly through our hearts in the background. And that here, right here, we have a community of beloved friends, our very own 7,000 who has our back. Now, I still have moments of dread about the future. I still catch myself replaying old tapes from my past I wish I could fix. In my own version of forgiveness school, I'm still only learning my ABCs. It's not easy. Cut yourself a break sometimes. To be compassionate enough with yourself to tell and give the version of yourself the grace you need. And what I'm learning slowly is to stop long enough, to pause, to listen. I'm learning how to release my need to control things, to let the sacred silence interrupt all the noise. Because somewhere in that silence, the place Elijah discovered up on that mountain, is a voice that reminds us of who we really are. A voice that says, fear does not get the last word. Oh no. A voice that invites us back into the life that we were created to live in the first place. A voice that accepts and affirms and loves us unconditionally, just as we are. No test required. And when we hear that voice, even faintly, we begin to realize something that I think is very extraordinary. If God can be present even in that kind of silence, then we're never truly alone. And we have so much less to fear and so much more to hope for than we ever believed. Amen.